Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Ream Library. I'm Tom Landy. I direct the Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at the college, and I'm really pleased to welcome today distinguished theologian and Notre Dame professor Matt Ashley, J. Matthew Ashley, to Holy Cross. His lecture today is called Living with Hope in a Crucified World, Resurrection Faith, Ignatian Spirituality, and Liberation Theology. His talk is one of the Deitchman family lectures on religion and modernity. It's a series that explores the place of religious and spiritual life in a world that's sometimes at odds with faith, other times in search of it, and always at work reshaping it. I invite you to learn more about the series and about our events by visiting our website, holycross.edu/CREC. If you're here for the first time, you can sign up for our email list and find out about upcoming events. You can also see on the left-hand side, there's a little tab that's called Listen and Learn, and you can go back if you want to listen to some parts of this or other talks and figure out some of the details again that way. You can hear them that way. So, Professor Ashley, as I said, is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. He's focused his research on political and liberation theology, Christian spirituality, and the dialogue between theology and science. He's the author of Interruptions, Mysticism, Politics, and Theology in the work of Johann Baptist Metz, and has contributed articles to many publications. He's currently working on a book on the impact of Ignatian spirituality on two 20th century Jesuit theologians. Today's talk will give us something of a preview of some of his thinking on that project. So please welcome Professor Ashley.
Thanks, Tom, for that generous introduction. It's nice to be here, coming from a place that is, shall we say, topographically challenged. It's actually nice to be a place where there are hills and mountains, and so I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to speak on this topic. As Tom mentioned, I am working on a book. The reason why I went from 3 to 2 is that the book was just getting too long. I realized if I did a third, it would be like 400 pages, and I don't like reading 400-page books, and I really didn't want to write one either. But so anyway, this is some of my thinking about how the relationship between spirituality and academic theology, and I think in particular John Sobrino, who I'll be talking about today, offers us some fascinating insights into what that might be. So let me begin. In December of 1969, the Jesuits of what was then called the Vice Province of Central America met to discuss how they should respond to the dramatic events sweeping through Latin America during that decade, including the meeting of Latin American bishops at Medellin the year before, which had produced documents that were nothing short of revolutionary, with their advocacy of what came to be known as the option for the poor. The Jesuits present at this province retreat worked communally through a form of Ignatius's spiritual exercises, and they ended up committing themselves to, quote, the redemption and liberation of Central America, and to deepening their willingness to put themselves and their institutions at the service of the poor. At a later meeting in September 1970, the provincial leadership decided that, quote, our institutions should foment attitudes of commitment to the social liberation of our peoples, giving that the theological depth of being viewed as an integral part of the redemptive liberation of Jesus Christ. This commitment on their part brought dramatic changes in the way the Jesuits of Central America trained their young men, ran their parishes, and educated El Salvador's middle and upper classes at their high school and college in the capital city of San Salvador. These changes, which were strongly supported and even deepened by Archbishop Oscar Romero, brought a backlash that we all know about. Among other things, the murder of Jesuit priest and pastor Rutilio Grande in 1977, the assassination of Archbishop Romero in 1980, and of 6 Jesuits and 2 women co-workers on the grounds of the university in 1989. I might add that the chief target of the 1989 assassinations was the university's president, Ignacio Yacuria, who was also one of the principal planners and speakers at the province-level retreat 20 years earlier. Tens of thousands of others lost their lives in the bloody violence in El Salvador, and names like El Mozote and Rio Sompul entered the lists of shame in humanity's history of violence. Events like these are familiar, if appalling, variations on a theme in the history of Latin America and of the movement known as liberation theology. Was it worth it? Is the situation of Latin America's poor better now than it was 4 decades ago? I find this, speaking personally, a rather self-indulgent question, since it's very easy for me to ask that from my vantage point of relative security and affluence. Much ink has been spilled on liberation theology and whether it succeeded in the agenda that it set for itself. But at least one outcome that they envisioned at the province retreat of 1969 did come to pass. At a concluding talk, Jesuit Ricardo Falla predicted to his fellow Jesuits that if they followed through on the commitment they had made, they would, quote, experience death and resurrection. Death, yes, but resurrection? Disappointment and suffering, yes, but joy and hope? Are not the events more Good Friday with little or no Easter? And what was it that continued to sustain them and many others who worked with them once the enthusiasm of 1967 or, say, 1993, when the peace accords were signed that ended the civil war in El Salvador, gave way to the dreadful insight that the plight of the poor is no less desperate for being off the front pages of our newspapers? And it raises other questions. If one invests so much hope for a better world here, with outcomes like these, does not one risk exhaustion, disillusionment, embitterment, or as Pope Benedict XVI worries, a fanaticism and a violence that would force the world for which one hopes into being, no matter what the cost to others? To frame the question in the language of Benedict's recent encyclical, Spe Salvi, what is the relationship between the great hope in the resurrection in which we are saved, Romans 8:24, and those hopes, some greater, some lesser, out of which we live and act in our day-to-day lives, but which are so often disappointed, or even when achieved, unsatisfying? This afternoon I explore this question of hope with you, looking at the work of Jesuit John Sobrino, with a few references to his friend and co-worker Ignacio Yacuria, who was murdered on November 16, 1989, by the Atlacato Battalion of the Salvadoran Army, because of the audacious hopes that he tried to put into action. I do so by looking at their thoughts on the resurrection, surely a key starting point for talking about Christian hope. In the process, I would like to persuade you of something else, and that is that their insights into Christian hope can be illuminated, at least, by considering how Ignatius of Loyola treats the resurrection and the hope of resurrection in his spiritual exercises. In order to do that, I have to presume some knowledge of Ignatius's spiritual masterpiece, and to that end, I would ask you to allow me a brief primer, perhaps unnecessary here and certainly inadequate given the presence in this room of many who know the exercises well. In general, the spiritual exercises present a carefully structured set of meditations, reflections, rules for, in Ignatius's own words, preparing and disposing the soul to rid itself of its disordered affections, and then seeking and finding God's will in the ordering of our life for the salvation of our souls. In his reflections on the spiritual exercises, another Jesuit theologian, Karl Rahner, argues that they provide a method for navigating a kind of a gray area in the Christian life. On the one hand, we all know about certain objective moral norms, thou shalt not kill, or precepts of the church, the Easter duty, attending Mass on Sundays. These are universal and they are equally binding on all, even though their precise application can be complicated. On the other hand, there's a wide field of choices that are, as it were, morally neutral. Will I have cornflakes or Raisin Bran for breakfast? What will I watch on TV tonight? But less trivially, what career will I choose? Will I get married or stay single? There are no universal rules for making these decisions. Yet what if, Rahner asks, God has a specific will for each of us in at least some of these matters? Then would not these choices have the same kind of moral seriousness as those for which we have these universal moral rules? But if that's true, how do we discern whether a particular matter is of that kind, and in that case, what God's will for us might be? This is precisely what, according to Rahner, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius were designed to do. They do this work in 4 stages, conventionally named weeks, even though they do not necessarily or even usually last for 7 days. During the first week, as it's called, Ignatius has the one making the exercises come to grips with the power of sin as a death-dealing reality that has the entire world in its grip and in which he or she is individually complicit. Now, the point is not just to inculcate guilt or shame, and certainly not hopelessness or despair, because God's forbearance, and indeed God's response, is present throughout that week. It's famously so in an imaginative scene toward the end of that week, in which I imagine myself before Christ on the cross, the first reference to Christ in the spiritual exercises, and ask myself, quote, how it is that the Creator has become human to die on a cross, and all for me. And to ask myself, what have I done for Christ? What am I doing for Christ? What ought I to do for Christ? Some of you may know that Ignacio Echeverria himself used this set of questions in a talk that he gave at your sister school across the country, Santa Clara University, in 1982, where he said, he was speaking of the work of the UCA, the Jesuit university, to the members of the university community there, and he said, well, how will you help us? That is not for me to say, Echeverria told them. Only open your human heart, your Christian heart, and ask yourself the 3 questions Ignatius of Loyola put to himself as he stood in front of a crucified world. What have I done for Christ in the world? What am I doing now? And above all, what should I do? The outcome that Ignatius expects from the first week is that we will cry out, as he puts it, in an exclamation of wonder and surging emotion that we have not been left consigned to the power of sin by God, and that we will engage in what he calls a colloquy of mercy, in which we thank God for God's great mercy, and we promise to amend our lives in the future with God's grace. This combination of a profound sense of the power of sin and of a deep gratitude for God's merciful response provides the launching point for the second week, in which we hear the call of Christ to join him in his work. But it is a necessary launching point. Gratitude is the necessary launching point. If one has not received the grace of the first week, a sober realization of the power of sin within me and without me, along with a deep gratitude for the God who intervenes to redeem me and all of us from it, then Ignatius will not have the person continue to the rest of the exercises. If one has been given this grace, though, one is ready to take up the choice that one is bringing. Remember that choice of something that, at least on one level, seems morally neutral, but we have a sense is something for which God has a particular will for us. This is the work of the second week, and Ignatius's famous rules for discernment are associated with it. We're not going into the rules for discernment this evening, but I would make one point, and that is that in order to best understand the process of choosing, of discernment, as Ignatius calls it, and the rules for discernment, it is best to remember that Ignatius assumes that while one is in this process of choice, and the rules are being used, one is also engaged in contemplations in the second week that present in vivid images Jesus' life and ministry as portrayed in the Gospels. One labors with all one's imagination to portray the gospel scenes, indeed to enter into them, to imagine oneself a part of the drama being worked out. For example, in the Contemplation on the Nativity, Ignatius has the retreatant, quote, see in imagination the road from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Consider its length and its breadth, whether it is level or winds through valleys and hills. Similarly, look at the place or the cave of the Nativity. How big is it? How small? How low? How high? Ignatius has us put ourselves in the scene, imagining ourselves, quote, a poor little unworthy slave looking upon Mary and Joseph, helping them as best we can. We consider what they are doing, quote, journeying and toiling in order that the Lord may be born in great poverty, and so that after so much work, so much hunger, thirst, heat, cold, injuries, and insult, he would die on the cross for me. And then I will reflect and draw some spiritual profit. Spiritual profit. If one is walking with Jesus this way, placing oneself imaginatively with him, in his work, then can this fail to have an impact, a resonance, an echo on how I imagine myself given the option that I'm considering for today? I think Ignatius' strategy is clear from the grace for which we pray and try to open ourselves during this week. Quote, an interior knowledge of our Lord, who became human for me, so that I may love him more intensely and follow him more closely. Walking imaginatively with Jesus, our imaginations, our desires, our hopes are shifted in subtle ways. And with this transformed imagination, one or another option that I'm considering will, Ignatius believes, resonate in a certain kind of way. But not without resistance. And that's why a spiritual director is needed, someone to accompany me who has some principles or rules at hand. This is the way that Ignatius thinks it will become clearer to me which option I'm considering is closer to what God desires. During the third and fourth weeks, we follow Jesus through to the conclusion of his work when it is taken up into and embraced by the paschal mystery of death and resurrection. In the third week, Ignatius tells us to desire sorrow with Christ in sorrow, a broken spirit with Christ so broken, and an interior suffering because of the suffering which Christ has endured for me. Finally, in the fourth week, we pray for the grace to be glad and to rejoice intensely. This theme of rejoicing and celebration is going to come back in a crucial way in Sobrino's thought. Because of the great glory of Christ our Lord. We're going to return to the fourth week later, but before I actually turn to Sobrino, let me make two general points about the structure of the spiritual exercises. First, Ignatius did not think of the weeks as progressive phases, such that if you finish one up, you leave it behind and you go on to the next. One might think, well, beginners stay in the first week, but the really spiritual advanced folks spend all their time in the fourth week. But it's not like that. We are never done with the work of the first week, deepening our awareness of the power of sin and experiencing an ever greater amazement at God's response. Nor do we finish our encounter with Christ in order to come to a deeper awareness of who he is for us, nor following him in his suffering through the world's rejection. Ignatius does expect that when making the exercises, we'll be drawn by God's Spirit to spend more time on one or another of these elements, one of the weeks. And he tells the one giving the exercises to be sensitive to this and not to rush somebody on prematurely. But all of the graces of all the weeks never cease being a part of a Christian life. Second, while Ignatius originally conceived of the exercises as appropriate for making some major life choice, embracing religious life, for instance, over time the use of the exercises was broadened to include a regular, perhaps annual occasion to stop and take stock of one's life and the choices one has already made. Have I embraced those choices as fully and integrally as I could have? Are there ways they could become materials for an even more radical following of Jesus? This use of the exercises, I think, fits most closely with the famous mottos of the early Jesuits, finding God in all things and being a contemplative in action, which, although they are often associated with the fourth week and the contemplation to attain God, love of God, which we're going to talk about in a minute, they actually never used there explicitly, even in the exercises as a whole. Well, a lot more could be said, but I hope this is enough of a sketch of the spiritual exercises so that I can try and use them to illuminate the sort of theology that John Sobrino does, and in particular talking about a resurrection hope. So let me turn to Sobrino. John Sobrino discusses the resurrection in the second volume of a 2-volume work on Jesus Christ, a Christology, as we call it. Before I turn specifically to his discussion, let me make a few remarks about the way he approaches Christology, and actually theology as a whole. At the beginning of the first volume, Jesus Christ the Liberator, which came out in 1991, so 2 years after his friends, his whole community was wiped out. The only reason he wasn't killed is he was away giving a lecture. So he was in the midst of writing this book. He wrote the second book on the risen Christ afterwards. So 1991, he gave the orientation of his book. While he understands the book to be a work of academic theology, so it's chock full of footnotes, technical vocabulary, and discussion and arguments with other academic theologians, he points to something more, he says, that a Christology, indeed any theology, should do. Christology, he writes, needs to unleash the power of human intelligence, and it certainly ought to do this. But it should do the same with other human powers. Its work has to be rigorously intellectual, and some would say it ought to be doctrinal too, ought to deal with doctrines. But its essence lies more deeply in being something spiritual, that it help persons and communities encounter Christ, to follow Jesus, to live as new men and women, and conform this world to the heart of God. Now, I mention this overall orientation of the book to make at least an initial case to you that Sobrino's understanding of Christology as an academic and a spiritual work parallels what Ignatius is up to in the spiritual exercises. Remember, in the second week, the point is not to have a detached knowledge of Jesus Christ, but an interior knowledge of him, so that we may love him more intensely and follow him more closely. So with Sobrino's understanding of Christology, to help individuals and in communities find, encounter Jesus, and follow him more closely. Now, an implication of defining Christology this way, which can help us see what is at stake, is that a most complete knowledge of Jesus is available to those who follow him. As I have already suggested, as one struggles to follow Jesus, not only one's intelligence, but one's other powers are transformed. One's moral power to commit oneself freely to some great and important work. The power to love deeply and to hope courageously connected with that kind of commitment. These powers are gradually transformed. The way that one sees reality, the way that one lets reality make a claim on them to act, and what he or she hopes for as the outcomes of these actions. These get transformed in the process of following. And with these transformed eyes of the heart and the mind, one can understand more fully who Jesus is and what he means for us. This does not mean, for Sobrino, that, say, someone who's an atheist or an agnostic and does detailed New Testament work on the so-called historical Jesus doesn't know anything about Jesus, but he would insist that that knowledge is, in a very real sense, incomplete. Or to come at the point from a slightly different angle, thinking again about that grace of the second week, on a first reading, you might think it's a sort of a one-way process. I sit here and I think and I imagine very carefully about Jesus. I decide who he is. And then after that, I decide what I'm going to do. Sobrino suggests that it's more complicated to that. That when I decide what it is I'm going to do to follow Jesus and try and put that into action, that changes me. And when I return to Jesus with those changed eyes, I know more than I knew before. In other words, I know Jesus more fully, I follow Jesus more fully in order to know him more fully. Now, there's an edge to this insight, and it's one of the more controversial points of liberation theology, and it is this. What if one particular way of following Jesus has a privileged place? What if there is a way of following Jesus that makes essential aspects of who Jesus is, and therefore who God is for us, available to us that are not available in any other way? And what if that particular way of following Jesus is to take up the desperate needs of the world's poor, and in whatever limited way, to seek to liberate them from those needs? Well, then what you have is liberation theology's statement of the option for the poor, which is not just an ethical commitment that we take up after we have sifted through Scripture and the Jesus portrayed there, but an indispensable prerequisite, something that comes before understanding who Jesus is at all. When Sobrino works out this Christology with its sort of spiritual core, he talks about a fundamental fourfold structure that he thinks is evident in the gospel presentation of the person and reality of Jesus. These categories are incarnation, mission, cross, resurrection. And yes, there are four, and there are 4 weeks, and we could fool around a little bit to get this correspondence. I think there is one there, but we won't do that here. Now, we're interested in the last one, resurrection, but we have to say a couple things about the other three in order to get there. Incarnation, for Sobrino, is not just a single event, which we celebrate on the Feast of the Annunciation, nor is it just the taking flesh of the second person of the Trinity, although it is that. It is for Sobrino a fundamental structure that expresses the way that God enters history in Jesus at a particular point to transform it, but also in doing that becomes vulnerable to history. Each one of us is defined to some extent not just by our physical bodies, Sobrino and many others would say, but by the particular history into which each of us is born. A history that shapes us, which we have to work with and endure, for better or worse. My son's trying to find a job right now. He's a senior at Notre Dame, so I'm very clear about how he's trying to make sense of the particular history that he's in. So we try and make sense of that history, we struggle with it, and perhaps we try and change it so that it's better for ourselves, for our friends, for our children. To be human is to be historical in this sense. And so incarnation means entering fully into history instead of trying to stay out of the fray. The Son of God also lived in history, the history of first century Palestine, just as we do in ours. No, actually, he does so more fully than we do, because we have various evasion mechanisms to try not to think about our history and what it requires of us. For those of you who are familiar with the spiritual exercises, I would briefly mention Ignatius' own contemplation on the Incarnation, which is right at the beginning of the second week, with an intricate interweaving of three vantage points. First, Ignatius has us imagine the sort of Trinity-eyes view, the persons of the Trinity looking down on the world and deciding to save it. Second, the world, seen in all its breadth and diversity, but Ignatius has us imagine seen as a place in which men and women are lying to each other, wounding each other, and killing one another. Remember, this is after the first week in the power of sin. What's God going to do? Well, the third element is a place, and it's named with exquisite precision. We imagine, quote, the house and rooms of Our Lady in the city of Nazareth. Didn't get it yet? In the province of Galilee. It identifies it exactly. The contemplation weaves together these three vantage points in order to bring us to incarnate ourselves in our particular history, not the rooms of Our Lady in the city of Nazareth in the province of Galilee, but in the buildings of the College of the Holy Cross in the city of Worcester in the state of Massachusetts. This is what incarnation is about. And each of us imitates Jesus and comes to know Jesus in that reality of incarnation to the extent that we enter fully into our own history with its joys and its challenges. For Sobrino, God enters history among and on the side of the poor to proclaim good news to the poor, as in Luke chapter 6. And thereby for all of us. This is Jesus' mission, that's the second element, which he carries out in his words and in his deeds, actions that feed the hungry, give back health to the sick, and reintegrate the despised into community. These actions are for Sobrino sacraments. They are signs of a future kingdom of God, which they make present, however momentarily, provisionally, fragmentarily. It is not hard to see how this Christological element can inform our understanding of Jesus and our following. We follow Jesus by continuing this work wherever in history we find ourselves incarnate. Because the world is in the grip of the power of sin, remember the first week, the world reacts back against Jesus, leading ultimately to his crucifixion and death. This dimension, too, Sobrino insists, must inform our knowledge of Jesus and following of Jesus. It also changes the way we look at the plight of the world's poor. If our minds and hearts have been changed so that we see the killing of Jesus not as the execution of a criminal who got what he deserved, or even the failure of a well-meaning but naive activist, but see it as an ultimate expression of Jesus' faithfulness to the will of the Father, the end result of his fidelity to his history that he became incarnate in, then we will change the way we look at the world's poor, those people who, as Gustavo Gutierrez puts it, die before their time. This is behind Sobrino's bold statement, or naming of the poor as crucified people, something that he took from Ignacio Ellacuría. Once again, it's not hard to see how this could become a part of our own lives. The world pushes back when we try and change it for the better. Now we come finally to the resurrection. But the problem here is obvious, and Sobrino states it that way. If in every element of Jesus' life there is something to know and something to incorporate into our own following of Jesus, how can we possibly imitate Jesus in his resurrection? Is not resurrection something that waits for us or that we think about only in terms of our own biological demise or that of our friends and loved ones? He states his answer at the beginning of a 100-page section on the resurrection. Don't worry, I only have 8 more to go myself. He says, "My viewpoint presupposes that the risen Christ can become present and victoriously present in the following of the crucified Jesus, so that this following can here and now be shot through with the triumphant aspect of the resurrection of Jesus." Even more boldly, Sobrino claims that to the extent that the risen Christ does become present in the lives of those who are following Jesus, they live now in some small but significant ways as persons already resurrected. And what could it mean to live as an already risen person? A phrase, by the way, that Sobrino also took from a homily given by his friend Eacoria, a homily that Eacoria gave actually in the 1960s. Before we get to the meaning of living like a resurrected person, we should remember the principle that we've been operating with all along, that the fullest knowledge of Jesus is available to those who are following him. Those who follow Jesus have the eyes of the mind and heart transformed so that they view the world differently. And by virtue of this, Sobrino suggests, they can grasp and experience the power of Jesus' resurrection in a way that those who do not follow Jesus cannot. I mean, it's a more complicated way of saying that faith in the resurrection is an attribute of faith. Sobrino says a little bit about what this transformation might be like. He proposes that a person like this will hope that the suffering and death of the innocent is not the final word in history, but that somehow their suffering will be redressed and justice will be done for them. He also thinks that such a person will act so as to become ways for that to happen now. He even says to bring the crucified down from their crosses, or even, very boldly, to raise those who are crucified now. Now this sounds just as ridiculous on one level. How can one raise those who are crucified now? Take the crucified down from their crosses. Of course, and he recognizes this can't be a matter of resuscitating corpses. But remember, we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus. And whatever else it is, and those of you who have labored through the New Testament accounts of the risen Jesus know that it's very, very difficult to figure out how the New Testament thinks about the risen Jesus. But whatever else is going on, it's not the resuscitation of a corpse. The resurrection of Jesus is not like the rising of Lazarus. Sobrino says we have to dig deeper to get at what is most important in the resurrection of Jesus. What it is, he says, is something remarkable, a work of the power of God that no one would have thought possible. And for him, it is God's judgment on what had happened to Jesus. God did justice to Jesus by raising him from the death to which a sinful world had consigned him. Now, he says those sorts of things can happen today in limited and fragmentary ways as, quote, reverberations of the power of the resurrection through history. Now, it's important to realize here that he has someone very specific in mind, and it was someone who had a huge impact on Sobrino, and that is Oscar Romero, Archbishop of San Salvador from 1977 to 1980 when he was slain. Romero in El Salvador certainly did not resuscitate corpses, but he did give the poor of El Salvador hope when no one thought it was possible to do that or even reasonable to try. And he did, in small but significant ways, press for their cries for justice and find ways to redress them. These modest ways of acting are, for Sobrino, ways that we take the crucified down from their crosses. Now, Romero did this because he saw reality as, yes, shot through with sin, but also filled with the promise of God's presence. Even if, like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he struggled to discern that promise and ultimately had to hand himself over in trust to this God that he did not completely understand. Now, if one's heart and mind have been transformed, Sobrino says, so that he or she can entertain this kind of hope, acts in this particular way to bring the crucified down from their crosses, and can see in reality, yes, sin, but also promise, then one can experience the power of Jesus' resurrection now. This is not something that one can learn from books or lectures, certainly not from this one. It comes as a work, hard work, of walking with Christ. Finally, then, these followers also find, Sobrino says, that they can celebrate, they can rejoice in history. And let me just remind you as a kind of a footnote that that's the particular grace that Ignatius associates with the fourth week, to be joyful. Now, it is to me remarkable, almost scandalous, that in 1999, which is when the second volume of the Christology came out, after Sobrino had seen so much corruption and deception, so much violence and death, so many broken promises, and so many dashed hopes, he could still write a section in his book entitled, Celebrating the Fullness of History, Living as Those Who Are Already Risen. He points out in that section that the New Testament shows us disciples who have met the risen Christ and live a new life, lived with meaning and joy. As he puts it, the element of triumph in Jesus' resurrection is not limited to Jesus alone, but it flows out from him and changes the quality of their lives. This joy does not remove one from history or cause one to gloss over or ignore the continued presence of suffering and evil in history. As a matter of fact, and this is important, I want to emphasize this, for Sobrino, a resurrection hope enables one to see more clearly the power of sin in history, engage it more radically, and pay a higher price. Romero, too, is his figure here. In other words, it is not the cynical and the resigned, those who have given up, who see most clearly and experience most clearly the pain and suffering of our world, but precisely the hopeful. So it's not a zero-sum game between disappointment and hope. They can go together. That's the paradox of the resurrection hope. You'll remember that in Sobrino's outline, the first element of spirituality is that element of incarnation, entering fully into a particular point in history. What Sobrino is saying is that there's a kind of a cycle here, that the element of resurrection leads back again to the element of incarnation, embracing history more deeply. One becomes more present to one's own history with all of its ambiguity and all of its disappointment. Sobrino states it this way: the fact that life can be celebrated is basic to understanding and living the resurrection of Jesus. This is, of course, not a matter of entertainment or diversion. It is a matter of a radical honesty about reality and a faithfulness to reality, which enables us, despite everything, to recognize, together with others, what is good and positive in small matters and large, which press us then to celebrate it. It's written in 1999. This is what, as I've already suggested, Sobrino sees in Archbishop Romero. Someone so infused with the power of Jesus' resurrection that he has the freedom, I would say as a footnote, this is the Ignatian notion of indifference, the freedom to love the poor of his country and put the church at their service, no matter what the cost, and the capacity to feel a joy that sustained him, even in his darkest hours, and he had some really dark hours. And in this way, Romero became himself a sort of a sacrament of the resurrection for the poor there. He still is today. A sacrament is a sign that brings about what it symbolizes. Romero's freedom and joy, which found expression in his service, both signified what the resurrection of Jesus means and made it a reality that happened for others. Experiencing the power of resurrection hope in his own life so that he could live in a fragmentary but real way as one already risen, he made it possible for others to do the same. If I take up that initial question that I drew from Benedict XVI's encyclical, the great hope inspired by Jesus' resurrection empowers freedom and joy that informs our commitment to all those particular hopes we have for our history, that we can and we must hold for this crucified world. To the extent that we do that, others are able to hope and to love in turn. As Sobrino writes, hope springs from love, and where there is hope, love begins to be produced. Let me finish by turning back to Ignatius. I've been suggesting throughout this lecture that Sobrino is working out an Ignatian approach to what a resurrection hope might mean in our world so full of suffering. Let me add by this immediately that I do not mean by this that somehow this is an exclusively Ignatian hope. I mean, Ignatius was Christian, after all. So that other Christians who do not share this spirituality would find this foreign or strange. Nor let me add, because he's told me this, do I think that Sobrino somehow set out to write a theology that came out of the spiritual exercises. I actually gave a talk like this and he responded to me. And he said there was some truth to it, but what he told me was that what was just as important for him and for Ea Korea were the people of El Salvador who worked so courageously, particularly, as I've said before, Romero, but the other martyrs, as he calls them. My own sense is that these people themselves were living out these Ignatian insights, so that when he was inspired by them, in some ways Sobrino was doing something like reading living texts in Ignatian spirituality. But that really isn't important. More modestly, what I would simply say is that what I've been trying to show you is that if you use this Ignatian, the exercises and the meditations, you can get a sense of what Sobrino is up to. So in that vein, let me come back to the exercises. And one of its most well-known meditations in this fourth week, which is the one about the resurrection, it's called the Contemplation to Attained Love for God. And it's got the famous Ignatian prayer that you've probably all heard, the Susape at the end of it, take, Lord, receive. Let me start by reminding you again that the fourth week is the fourth week. It presumes the first three. Ignatius assumes that before one comes to prayer on the risen Jesus, one has encountered profoundly and painfully the power of sin in oneself and in one's world, along with the reality and cost of one's redemption. He presumes that one has committed oneself in a very concrete way to a more radical imitation of Jesus in whatever life situation one finds oneself, whatever one's history, and is aware of the cost that will come with that. The grace of resurrection is not a cheap grace that can be had outside of an embrace of the whole journey through the realities of sin, discipleship, and cross. Now, we've seen Sobrino says the same thing. Any embrace of the resurrection in which the pain and the cries of those who still suffer today, who are still crucified or can no longer be heard, would be profoundly unchristian. The paradox of resurrection hope, as I've suggested, is that it is precisely in hearing those cries and in responding to them, no matter what the cost, no matter the disappointments that one endures, that one can live now as already risen. Now, to look specifically at Ignatius and his reflections on the risen Jesus, one feature of the meditations of this week is that Ignatius has us pay particular attention to what the risen Jesus does. Now, of course, he's been doing that all along. We follow Jesus, looking at what he is doing, healing people, feeding people, chastising people. He says, what does Jesus do? The risen Jesus, frees those who are trapped in death. As Ignatius has us look at the traditional doctrine of the descent to hell. Most tenderly, Ignatius has us consider that, and this is one of the few really unscriptural points in Ignatius' spiritual exercises, he has us consider that the first thing the risen Jesus does is to visit his mother, who, and we did the person doing the exercises prayed on this in the third week, considering how Mary and the other disciples are left exhausted, grief-stricken, on the verge of despair by Jesus' execution. And so what Jesus does is to come to them, to console them. We consider Jesus' divinity, Ignatius says, which appears and manifests itself in his resurrection and its true and most holy effects. Now, what is the holy effect? He tells us in the very next section. He says, we should keep us in mind, consider the office of consoler, which Christ our Lord carries out, and compare it with the way that friends console one another. Now, this brings us to another central Ignatian concept, and that is the notion of consolation. Consolation, as the Jesuit historian John O'Malley has shown, is the key term in Ignatian spirituality. It denotes a condition in which we find it natural and spontaneously given to us to love God above all things and to love all things in God. It, quote, includes every increase in hope, faith, and love, and every interior joy that calls and attracts us to heavenly things, bringing the soul tranquility and peace in its Creator. Ignatius thought that consolation is self-diffusive. You can't keep it to yourself. That is why many of the first Jesuits, including Ignatius, talked about what they did as ministries of consolation. And why they believed that if consolation was being produced within what they were doing, no matter how diverse the ministry, then all was well. They thought that consoling others meant doing the work of the spiritual exercises, which did not necessarily have to mean giving the exercises. It meant helping people remove those barriers to experiencing consolation to themselves. This is what Ignatius meant by helping souls, as he called it. The sine qua non goal of all the ministries in which Ignatius and his first companions committed the early Society of Jesus. If one considers that list of ministries, it becomes apparent that helping souls meant helping embodied souls, souls encultured, in culture, in history. It included spiritual conversation, which Ignatius began doing almost immediately after his own conversion experience at Manresa, but also feeding the hungry, rescuing prostitutes, building beautiful churches, staging moving dramas, founding universities, all manner of things that would help people to find consolation in their lives and that would meet the crying needs that they saw. In other words, I think it's not too far of a stretch to say that what Sobrino calls taking people down from their crosses is what Ignatius has in mind by consolation. Now, this office of consoler, this is the principal work of the risen Jesus for Ignatius, and thus a fundamental mission for those who follow him. The contemplation to attain love, which ends the exercises, tries to help us imagine what it would be like. Interestingly, Jesus is not mentioned at all in the contemplation to attain love, as many have noted. I think this expresses something that Sobrino points out as well, and that is that the risen Jesus does not teach anything new vis-a-vis what one has learned in following Jesus up to the cross. No new parables, no new teachings. What is added is what Sobrino called a dimension of triumph, of joy and hope that reverberates through history and in the lives of believers. Ignatius thinks of it as the ability to live a life out of active love. He begins his meditation, a contemplation to attain love, and it means we don't have to attain God's love for us. That's taken for granted. What he wants us to do is find a way to deepen our love for God. And he does that by saying that love ought to manifest itself more in deeds than in words, and that it consists in a mutual communication between two persons. The one gives to another what he or she has, and the other gives in return. Ignatius then has us call to mind all the things that God has done for us, all the gifts that God has given to us. In nature, which God creates for our good and in which God indwells all things. In history, where God has been laboring on our behalf. He says, God has been acting like one who labors. He sort of repeats it again. Who works hard for us. Now, of course, we've been following that work in meditating on Jesus. Remember the meditation I gave you on the Nativity. Imagining Jesus who, after so much work for us, and it's a work in which God not only forgives us and heals us, but dignifies us with a call to work with God in bringing this same healing grace to others. Now, it would take an unusual obtuseness on the part of one who has spent over 3 weeks walking with Jesus and thinking about his or her own life's work, not to grasp multiple resonances in what this work meant. It means a giving back of gifts to God. The love with this contemplation is meant to help the one doing the exercises attain then, is an active love found in all the ways that God has worked for us and that I am trying to respond in working with God. Discerning where I am called precisely to do this is the point of the exercises. The breakthrough here that this exercise presses us is that this is how we find God in all things, present in our work, in laboring with God. Ignacio Ellacuría captured this in a set of lectures he gave on the spiritual exercises in 1974, where he talked about the fourth week as an experience of the world, created world, which despite being stricken by sin, is still a place where God can be found. And a world where we can retrieve it, we can pull it back, he says, as a home for human beings and a home for God. For Ellacuría, this finding in the world of God, this retrieving the world as a home for human beings, is a dynamic process. It's a process in which, Ellacuría says, God makes God's self present to the person acting, and the person makes God present and makes him or herself present to the God who's acting. See, now you can be really grateful I didn't talk a lot about Ellacuría, because he loves to do this sort of thing, and it's really beautiful in Spanish. I'm going to try and do it for you in Spanish to give you a sense of the texture of what he's saying here. And you'll forgive my pronunciation. Dios se hace presente al hombre haciendo, y el hombre hace presente a Dios, y se hace presente a Dios haciendo. It's not much easier in Spanish. But the cool thing is he uses this verb hacer, which I translated to act or to do or to make, to bring together God's acting and our acting. There are three moments tightly woven together. Dios se hace presente. God becomes present, or God makes God self-present. Al hombre haciendo, to the person acting. And the person makes God present. El hombre hace presente a Dios. And making himself or herself present to the God who is acting. Se hace presente a Dios haciendo. This is the interweaving of prayer and action. These multiple making present of God, the person, and the world. This mode of action for Ellacuría, which is the key of the contemplation to attain love, looks forward to a future in which the world will fully and victoriously be what it is experienced to be in that moment of consolation, a home for God, a home for human beings. To live in this dynamic of being a contemplative in action, Ellacuría called it a contemplative in the action for justice, is another phrasing of what Sobrino means by living as those risen. I conclude. I've suggested that Sobrino's theology of the resurrection, with a few references along the side to Ellacuría, and the approach to the resurrection and the spiritual exercises illuminate one another. Sobrino's claim is that the resurrection impinges on us now, and not just subsequent to our biological death. It reverberates down through history and should be an element of our following of Jesus, just as much as those other elements, incarnation, mission, cross. It leads us to a deeper incarnation into a world with so much suffering, which in turn, in a sort of a grace feedback loop, leads to a deeper experience of the power of the resurrection to sustain us in that. More importantly, these actions become conduits of grace whereby others enter into the same. Sobrino never says that we create the kingdom of God by our actions. He never says that. He does say that our actions can be signs of the kingdom that give others hope, the fullness of which comes only at the end of history, Sobrino insists. Neither does Sobrino say that we are fully resurrected now. We do have to die. But he does say that we can and should, in limited ways, expect to experience and celebrate the fullness of resurrection as signs to ourselves and to others of that fullness which God has promised to us. Particular hopes will be disappointed. Sobrino certainly experienced that. The world will continue to be one in which there is sin, in which there is evil, in which there are crosses. And yet, while cross and death are realities all too present in the lives of those who live as already risen people, equally so is a joy and a freedom that empowers love and as a consequence keeps on creating hope for ourselves and for others. If one is situated in a way that he or she is open to this way of understanding what is most real about history, which has been revealed to us in Jesus, this way of acting, this way of hoping, this way even of celebrating in history, then one is situated to experience persons and events as sacramental loci of the power of the resurrection. This will enable us to understand better what the New Testament is trying to communicate to us about Jesus' resurrection. I have suggested that Ignatius' spiritual exercises do the same, but in a very practical way, as Ignatius always was, in a set of prayers that map out how we could begin or embrace more fully this itinerary ourselves. It structures the insight that grace of the resurrection is specific and costly. It becomes available at the end of a process where we weave together our love for Jesus as we find him in the scriptures, our own life history, an itinerary that traverses without ever leaving behind the knowledge and radical imitation of Christ and his mysteries of incarnation, life, death, and resurrection. It holds open a promise that our lives can become lives suffused with consolation, which we then give on to others. Love consists in a communication of gifts. The Ignatian understanding of the grace of consolation and its relation to the ministries of consolation that the first Jesuits committed themselves to, I think maps nicely onto Sobrino's conception of the cycle of incarnation, mission, cross, and resurrection, which just leads back to deeper incarnation. In giving our lives in the office of consolation to others, we come intimately and consolingly into a union with God, who is always and everywhere at work for the same end. To be a contemplative in action is to live as one already resurrected. Ignatius concludes the fourth week and the Contemplation to Attain Love with a famous prayer. I'm sure you've all heard it a lot. I did. I went to Jesuit schools. Ignatius thinks that it is only natural that if we consider deeply enough God's love for us, actively present in so many ways, such a consideration will lead us to make a gift back to God. Gratitude is the driving engine of the spiritual exercises. An offering made, as Ignatius says, with deep affection. As I think Sobrino would say, an offering made in great freedom and in great joy, in which the power of the resurrection has reverberated down through history and continues to do so. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and all my will, all that I have and possess. You, Lord, have given all that to me. I now give it back to you, O Lord. All is yours. Dispose of it according to your will. Give me love of yourself, along with your grace, for that is enough for me. To live out of this offer is to live as one already resurrected and to have a resurrection hope in our crucified world. Thank you.